We were talking about world, flesh, devil. I want you to know this phrase, corporate flesh. I'm going to ask you. It's just one of those things I think is a very helpful model of understanding what the world is. So, now I'm talking about world, or adjective worldly, in its negative sense, right? So here's what it is. The evil that we're capable of producing is magnified when we gather together in groups. Another point here would be the nature of the evil we produce as groups, as specific cultures, will manifest itself in some ways differently from culture to culture. But it's a transcultural phenomenon. I can go to Africa, and guess what shows up? Corporate flesh. And then I come back to North America. This is, home territory. This is the air I've breathed all my life. And guess what's here too? Corporate flesh, but it manifests itself in a North American manner. Always present, however, in some way. Taking a look at just a couple of texts here. Remembering that when Jesus is speaking here, he's not speaking of the world as created by God. He's speaking of the world as distorted, cracked by sin. Two different meanings. Anything by definition created by God is a good thing. We talked about that last class. All right, John 15. John 15, verse 18. Christ teaches, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you don't belong to the world, but I've chosen you out of the world. That's why the world hates you. Remember the words that I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you also." Now, the reason for the persecution is simply because of such a direct clash in fundamental values. So the world, in this sense, hates what Christ represents because what Christ represents so directly challenges it. Take a look over at Romans. Romans chapter 12, I'm going to start with verse 1. "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." Did you catch that phrase? What I'd like you to think about deeply would be this. How does the pattern of this world manifest itself in North American culture? Or how has the pattern of this world manifested itself in my family life? In my own value structures? How does it appear? And it's very hard to identify because it's like the air we've breathed all our lives. It seems normal. At times it seems praiseworthy. J.B. Phillips. J.B. Phillips in the Phillips translation translates Romans 12:2 this way. "Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold." Let's think about that for a minute. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. So positively speaking, if we think of the world as created by God, there's many things about the world that we can enjoy. But when we move into this negative meaning of world as corporate flesh, it's as though there's an unholy force field squeezing against us, pulling against us, pushing against us. It's advocating values. It's advocating behaviors that ultimately lead to death. And part of what spiritual formation involves is increasingly being formed and shaped into a different mold. But it hurts. Because it's like the cracking of a bone that needs to be reset. Now, I want you to grab devotional classics. And I want you to turn to John of the Cross. He writes about what he calls the dark night of the soul. He's speaking of a time that almost all of us will encounter when God, in great love, will remove all the support systems and all the props, anything, how can I put it, secondary, that we have relied on for our sense of God's closeness to us, of God's love for us. During this period, it does not mean that God has in any way left. God is probably closer to us in terms of how God is working than ever before. But it seems, by all appearances, like a dark night. Have you had times when you've really prayed and nothing's happening? You've gone from a time when reading the scripture was like drinking a great Merlot, and now it's like drinking vinegar. It's like drinking sand. It's so dry. And yet, as you look at what's happened circumstantially in your life, it's not as though you're just rampantly running into sin. It seems like you're loving other people the way you always have. It seems like everything else is exactly the same, but it seems like he is gone, removed. That's what John means by the dark night. Well, take a look here. This is section 2. He's got a good sense of humor for someone who writes so much about the dark night. Beginners in the spiritual life are apt to become very diligent in their exercises, in their spiritual disciplines. And I would bet for some of us there probably was a time when we were very disciplined spiritually. Maybe for some of us still so. It's not a bad thing. The danger, however, he says, the great danger for them will to become satisfied with their religious works and with themselves. Now circle that. That's one of the great dangers of the spiritual life, to become satisfied with ourselves, to think that the work is finished, the work is done, I've got to where I need to be, and now I can start teaching other people. It is easy for them to develop a kind of secret pride, which is the first of the 7 capital sins. Are you familiar with the capital sins? This is in Roman Catholic moral theology, and there's something to it. By capital sins, the church means sins that are particularly deadly, particularly harmful. They damage the human soul. I, for one, and we could talk about this, but I, for one, do not believe that all sins are the same. Jesus himself taught that all sins were not the same. He said, in speaking of Capernaum and Bethsaida, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for you, Bethsaida, and for you, Capernaum. For if I had done the things I did in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. Well, there's no way in the world he can use more or less language if all sins are the same. Think of it this way too. Say someone wasn't understanding something in class and you raise your hand, you're not getting something, and my response is, what do you mean you're not getting it? How many times do I have to teach this? You know, I've been watching you the whole class, you're not paying attention. You know, why don't you just leave for the day? Out. That's it. In fact, don't come back. Glad you're gone. Everybody would be going, what's happening? We're not safe. He's lost his mind. Right? Sinful, yes? Would that be sinful? Yes, yes, yes. Of course. Well, what if I'm just sitting here in the front row and I've had a bad day and I pull out a 45, pull it to this guy's head and just go, boom. That was a very lively illustration, wasn't it? Now, do you get my point? Do you get my point? I want to make sure you understand this. Number one, the smallest The smallest sin can separate us from God for all eternity. The smallest. A moment's impatience. Something where just on a bad day, we become angry with somebody just because it feels really good. The smallest sin can separate us from God for all eternity. Having said that, Christ, the Apostle Paul, do distinguish between certain sins and name certain sins as being particularly serious. So when we speak of St. John here, of capital sins, he's thinking of capital in the sense of a capital crime. What's a capital crime? What verdict does a capital crime carry? It's a death penalty. So they kill the soul. They kill the soul. It's interesting that anger is one of them. That deep-rooted bitterness, that anger that can just corrode us internally, devour us internally. Avarice, wanting somebody else's, what they possess, and feeling like that, I'm going to get that, that's mine, it shouldn't be theirs. That's connected to another deadly sin, envy, and so on. So let's go back to the text now. Pride, of course, always near the top of the list. Now look at the description that he gives of these kinds of people. It's very surprising. You wouldn't think that a great saint of the church would write this way or ever say that this could be possible. But John says, such persons become too spiritual. They like to speak of spiritual things all the time. They become content with their own growth. They would prefer to teach rather than to be taught. They condemn others who are not as spiritual as they are. They are like the Pharisee who boasted in himself and despised the publican who is not as spiritual as he. Remember that text? Oh, God, I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector. And you think the man is praying to God, but he's actually praying about himself. The devil, this is a very interesting one since we're talking about flesh world devil. The devil will often inflame their fervor so that their pride will grow even greater. They become so spiritual, it's devilish. The devil knows that all of their works and virtues will become valueless, and if unchecked, will become vices, for they begin to do these spiritual exercises to be esteemed by others. They're showing off spiritually. They're purposely planning things out in such a way that someone will see them, or at least know this is a fast day, or yes, I am praying, or whatever it might be, whatever the behavior might be. And then how about this one? They also begin to fear confession to another, for it would ruin their image. So for this person who's very young in the spiritual life and too spiritual, it's all, in a manner of speaking, it's all make-believe. It's not the real thing. It's all done to impress. Look at me. Look how spiritual I am. Would you want to be around these kinds of people? I'd rather go to a Phillies game. I'd rather go to a movie than someone who I know when I sit down next to them, they're going to have to talk about something, in quotation marks now, spiritual, because that's all they've got. But it's a distorted kind of spirituality. It's surely not a spirituality connected to the wonder of God's created world.